Hello.
Hello, police.
Yeah, what's the problem, sir?
We just drove down our farm track.
Yeah.
Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it.
Yeah.
It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And in this video, we're going to be taking a look at a news article from the Evening Echo from 1998. This is an interview with Ivan Dibley, the detective who was leading the investigation early on. This will give you an idea of some of the policing tactics used in the capturing and conviction of Michael Steele and Jack Wombs. We will now start with the newspaper article from the Evening Echo from 1998. How I Caught the Killers by the Evening Echo, 21st of the 1st, 1998. Superintendent Ivan Dibley was enjoying breakfast at his Chelmsford home when his phone rang that snowy morning. He was being offered the chance to take over what would be his last and possibly most complex case, the triple gangland killing of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. But December the 7th, 1995 was Mr. Dibley's day off, and he had promised his daughter that he would sort out an electrical problem. He had headed more than 25 murder cases in the previous 5 years, and he was due to retire following 32 years in the force. Only 2 remained unsolved, but 1995 had proved to be a good year, and he had cleared up 10 murders in as many months. Relaxing on a leather sofa at his home just weeks ago, Mr. Dibley explained, "I knew those bodies weren't going anywhere. No murder scene is a pretty sight. During my years in the force, I have dealt with people being burnt in fires and elderly women with their heads bashed in. But considering these men had been shot at close range with a shotgun, it could have been far, far worse. It didn't take long to identify the bodies." The Range Rover itself was registered to Craig Rolfe, and detectives had in fact questioned him the day before. Steele was in the frame from day one. A friend of Rolfe's revealed the dead men met him that evening, but police could not prove his finger was on the trigger. With virtually no forensic evidence, the team had to find some other way to catch him. Dibley said, "There wasn't even much on house-to-house inquiries. They took less than a day." As he wondered where to turn next, Dibley developed a theory about the murders. "I suspected Tate was the catalyst, and I proved to be nearly 100% right." Dibley went on to say, "I think after being incarcerated for quite a long time, he suddenly came out into the big wide world. Tucker took him under his wing, and soon he was dealing with large amounts of money. I think it began to go wrong because not only was Tate by nature a violent man, but towards the time of his death, he was becoming increasingly unstable due to drugs. But there was still a long way to go before Steele and Wombs would be arrested, and by then another officer, Superintendent Brian Story, would have taken over the case." Dibley said, "Although we had an indicator who it was, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. Some policemen may think that they are God, but I don't. I knew the people who were close to these characters would have a good idea what was going on, but no one talked, and that's why a strategy had to be adopted. That strategy included a sting operation using 2 officers, posing as IRA members, Billy and John. The pair made a series of phone calls to Steele and Tate's ex-girlfriend Sarah Saunders, claiming they had lent Tate money for a drug deal with Steele, and now they wanted it back. They also threatened Steele, perhaps hoping to goad him into admitting the murders. A terrified Sarah Saunders went to Basildon Police Station, who played along with the sting and said the calls had been made from a well-known Republican bar in Belfast. They said detectives were monitoring the men responsible, but had lost track of them when the gang travelled to the mainland. The idea appears to have been that Sarah, frightened for her life, would spill the beans on Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. Dibley, justifying the undercover operation, said, "We wanted to flush Steele out. We also wanted to provide evidence which we could put before a court." Dibley admitted Billy and John were an unusual tactic. There was a risk that we wouldn't be able to use them in court, but when you have no evidence, you have no choice. The team also checked mobile phone records and discovered Wholmes had made a call from Rettendon on the night of the killings. The case was 3/4 complete when Ivan Dibley retired. Only 2 weeks before, Steele, Wholmes, Nichols and others were arrested on May 13th, 1996. Dibley added, "I knew they had done the murders, I knew they were involved in drugs, and I knew we hadn't enough evidence to convict them. All we needed was a bit of luck. Everything had been put in place, and given a fair wind, it would have the result it deserved." But he did admit it was quite hard having to leave the investigation before it was finished. However, it doesn't matter when you retire from the police, it's never convenient. It was Dibley's groundwork that led to the successful conclusion of the case. During his research, Dibley had discovered Nichols was an associate of the killers. It was my view that the peripheral people involved would not want to dirty their hands with a triple murder. They were the weak link. And it was Nichols who eventually provided the vital evidence to nail Steele and Wholmes. So quite an interesting article there on how the police investigation took shape. What I found interesting was the mentioning of the undercover police officers during the telephone conversations with Michael Steele, where they were pretending to be from the IRA, the Billy and John characters. I've read through the transcripts of these telephone conversations. And when this was put to Michael Steele in court, he said that he had a 50-50% thought that this was the police trying to trap him. We know that Michael Steele was a naturally cautious man who sometimes used bugging devices on his phones. He was aware that he was under surveillance most of the time, and it's quite clear that he wouldn't have said anything during these phone conversations to implicate himself in the murder of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. It's also worth mentioning that during this undercover operation with the Billy and John characters, that this was around the time of the Canary Wharf bombing, so tensions were quite high. There was quite a lot of media coverage regarding those bombings, and really these tactics that were used by the detectives were frowned upon not only by the media but by the public who heard about them themselves. It just went to show ultimately the levels that these undercover officers were willing to go in order to convict Michael Steele and Jack Wholmes of these crimes. Although no real subsequent leads came from these telephone conversations with Michael Steele, it's a good insight, I believe, into the tactics that were used in order to try and get a confession or some sort of solid evidence that Michael Steele and Jack Wholmes were involved in these murders. As I say, nothing actually came of these telephone conversations, and what we know of Michael Steele being a cautious individual, I'm sure, in my opinion, he was well aware that he may have been under surveillance, as it were, and that these calls were actually from undercover officers. I believe that he knew that. And when I read the transcripts of these telephone conversations, I can almost picture Michael Steele throwing in some lines in order to try and trick them, to try and get these officers to show their hand. I believe he's an extremely smart individual, and he knew exactly who he was speaking to. Also, another interesting piece is where they mention Craig Rolfe. I know from reading through the statements that Craig Rolfe was seen by a plainclothes police officer on December the 6th, the day of the murders, at around 4 p.m. This was a passing conversation which lasted less than a minute, where this officer simply asked Craig if he could get his girlfriend to pop into the station to sort out her statement. I believe that may have been regarding the Kevin Whitaker murders or something along those lines. I'm not entirely sure, but that is what I assume. But it's interesting here that they're talking about Ivan Dibley and the actual discovery of the bodies, which we know is obviously December the 7th. And it mentions after the discovery of the bodies that it says the Range Rover was registered to Rolfe and detectives had in fact questioned him the day before. So do they mean the day before the murders, which would have been December the 5th, or do they mean December the 6th? The reason I believe they mean December the 6th, the day of the murders, is because they're talking about the actual discovery before they mention this piece. It's like they're saying the day before the discovery, which is the day of the murders, Craig Rolfe was contacted or spoke to detectives. I find that quite strange because there's no other statements that I have found which mentions Craig Rolfe talking to police officers or being seen by police officers on December the 6th. The only sighting we have is a very, very brief one, which, as I say, lasted less than a minute, where Rolfe was seen getting out of the Range Rover at Grays police station. So I find that a little bit strange. Did he actually speak to officers at some length, or was this simply the passing conversation which was mentioned in the police statement?